Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio from Monday, March 7, 2022. United Nations Security Council holding an emergency meeting focusing on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, especially as it hits the children, a week and a half after Russia's invasion of that country. The number of refugees fleeing the war now estimated at 1.7 million. And still, Russia denies it is targeting civilian areas with munitions or impeding the creation of safe corridors to let people escape. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky renewing his call for tougher international sanctions on Russia, including a ban on Russian oil imports. White House has been saying President Joe Biden opposes that idea, but now says it is being studied, although no decision has been made. As gas prices in the U.S. rise above $4 a gallon on average for the first time in a decade and a half. U.S. House and Senate back in session, one of the top agenda items this week, passing a federal government spending bill to avoid a shutdown, and that bill likely will include emergency aid for Ukraine and for fighting the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. And truckers calling themselves the People's Convoy continuing protesting COVID-19 restrictions, including vaccine and mask mandates. They're protesting around, but not in Washington, D.C. United Nations Security Council holding a meeting today on the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine as Russian military forces intensify their attacks not only on military targets but civilian areas. Briefing the United Nations Security Council, Martin Griffiths. He is UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator.
Do I need to describe what we have all seen and heard on the news? Simply put, millions of lives shattered. People can't stay home with shops shut, power and water cut, shells falling, phones switched off. They can't find what they need, even if they have money to pay for it. And as we have seen, even as the TV cameras roll, many can't flee in safety either in this conflict. It's been 11 days of escalating violence, fear, and pain. As of 6th of March, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 1,207 civilian casualties, including at least 406 dead, and I guess the real figure could be considerably higher. UNHCR reports that more than 1.7 million refugees have fled, and that figure is probably out of date already, in 11 days. Madam President, humanitarian assistance has continued in areas where security permits. Under the leadership of the crisis coordinator and the resident and humanitarian coordinator in country, we have new plans now, of course, on how to deliver where humanitarian needs are most acute. This includes the cities that we have seen so much on these last days, such as Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson. Our response is being scaled up from hubs in Vinnytsia, Uzhhorod, and Lviv. The UN and our partners, and we will hear, I'm sure, from Kathy in a minute, have already provided food to hundreds of thousands. The World Food Programme is setting up supply chain operations to deliver immediate food and cash assistance to 3 to 5 million people inside Ukraine. WHO has shipped trauma care, emergency surgery equipment, and other supplies that will help in days to come, thousands of people, and more supplies are on their way. HCR is providing assistance, albeit at a small scale at the moment, through a network of shops and supermarkets in Mariupol in collaboration with NGOs. MSF never left. It's training trauma surgeons, providing support for the people in that city.
Martin Griffiths, United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, part of his report to United Nations Security Council today in New York City. He referred to Kathy, that's Catherine Russell, Executive Director of the United Nations Children Agency, UNICEF.
As the fighting has now reached densely populated areas and across the country, we expect child casualties to increase. We also expect the displacement crisis to continue growing rapidly. As of yesterday, UNHCR was reporting in excess of 1.7 million refugees fleeing to hosting countries. Half of the people on the move are children. UNICEF is working closely with UNHCR to reach them with protection and assistance in receiving countries. I've just returned from Romania-Ukraine border, where thousands of women and children traveled to escape the fighting. I met with mothers and children who had to flee their homes at a moment's notice. They told me how it felt to leave everything they know behind, to leave husbands, fathers, and elderly loved ones, not knowing when or if they would see each other again. The children talked about being suddenly pulled out of school, of losing beloved toys, and the terrifying sound of shelling and gunfire. So many children have been deeply traumatized. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are working 24 hours a day to meet rapidly escalating humanitarian needs in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. From trucking in safe water for drinking and hygiene, providing emergency medical services, and providing shelter and protection for those displaced from their homes. At present, we have some 135 people working for UNICEF in Ukraine, and we are sending more to meet needs in country. UNICEF-supported child protection mobile teams are reaching children wherever they can with psychosocial care, mental health support, and protection services. The operating environment in Ukraine is extremely complex. Access constraints and rapidly changing front lines make it much more difficult to deliver critical supplies and services. The safety and well-being of our staff on the ground remains a top priority.
Catherine Russell is Executive Director of UNICEF, reporting to the United Nations Security Council today. UN estimating 12 million people in Ukraine and 4 million who will flee to neighboring countries in the coming months will be needing humanitarian assistance. Russia today proposing evacuating Ukrainian civilians, but only to Russia or Belarus, a Russian ally. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister saying that is an unacceptable option for opening humanitarian corridors. Also speaking at today's UN Security Council meeting, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield.
We must heed the call we heard today from the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. That means a sustained pause in hostilities to allow the safe passage of civilians who wish to leave areas of active conflict. The safe passage of humanitarian supplies, and the free and safe movement of those delivering humanitarian assistance. We need Russia's firm, clear, public, and unequivocal commitment to allow and facilitate immediate, unhindered humanitarian access for humanitarian partners in Ukraine. Very specifically, we call for the Russian Federation to agree to and honor in good faith Ukrainian proposals for time-bound humanitarian safe passage in specific agreed-upon locations. We call for the establishment of a ground-level notification system that will facilitate the safe movement of humanitarian convoys and flights. This is imperative for ensuring humanitarian supplies and commodities can be reliably transported into Ukraine to reach those most in need. I also want to note today that the United States is increasingly concerned about the protection of civilians in this conflict, particularly women and girls who are vulnerable to gender-based violence, LGBTQI Ukrainians, as well as Ukraine's population of older adults and people with disabilities. We also call for the protection and care of all vulnerable children, including separated and unaccompanied children and those in institutional care. Children should never be involved in conflict, period. Children should never be involved in conflict. They must be protected. The humanitarian toll of President Putin's war on Ukraine is mounting. Children are dying. People are fleeing their homes. And for what?
The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Following her, some remarks by the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzya, who denied Russia is the cause of this humanitarian crisis in Ukraine.
The permanent representative of the United States today accused us of not complying with our commitments to create safe humanitarian corridors. Let's get down into this. We once again wish to emphasize that safety for civilians in Ukraine is not a problem for Russian, because we're not bombarding them, but rather Ukrainian radicals and neo-Nazis who are holding hostage whole towns and cities and are making use of citizens as a human shield, not allowing them to leave cities despite the fact that there are humanitarian corridors and that Russian units have declared a ceasefire.
That's the Russian ambassador to the United Nations at today's UN Security Council meeting looking at the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. You can find the full meeting at our website, cspan.org. A Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, in an interview with Reuters, saying that Russia has told Ukraine it is ready to halt military operations in a moment if Ukraine meets a list of conditions. There are 4 of them. Ukraine must have a cease military action, change its constitution to enshrine neutrality so it doesn't ever join NATO, acknowledge Crimea as Russian territory, and recognize the separatist republics of Donetsk and Lugansk as independent states. Russia writes it's the most explicit Russian statement so far of the terms it wants to impose on Ukraine to halt what it calls its special military operation, now in its 12th day. Also today, word that the 3rd round of Russian-Ukrainian peace talks have ended with, and this is from the Financial Times, delegations reporting some positive signs but no breakthrough. An advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky said there have been some small positive developments in improving the logistics of humanitarian corridors. He tweeted that intensive consultations continued on the basic political block of a peace agreement as well as ceasefire and security guarantees, and the head of the Russian delegation to the talks telling Interfax that they were not easy, fell short of Russia's expectations, and it's too soon to talk of something positive. That was reporting for Financial Times. For an assessment of how the war is going from the U.S. Defense Department, what the Russian military strategy has been and what to expect in the coming days, a question to the Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby.
I wonder if you could discuss sort of the overall direction of the Russian campaign in Ukraine. I'm thinking in particular, for example, of their increased use of long-range fires, artillery and rockets in recent days. Yeah. Is this an adjustment by them? Is this a new phase of the war? Are they compensating for problems in other areas? Or how would you describe the thrust of where they are right now?
With the caveat, Bob, that we don't have perfect visibility into Russian plans. What we believe is happening as the Russians continue to get frustrated and slowed down, and they really haven't made any noteworthy progress in the last few days, with the exception of down south. In the south, they continue to have some progress, but up in the north and northeast. What we assess is as they continue to get frustrated, they continue to rely now more on what we would call long-range fires. So this is bombardment, missile strikes, long-range artillery into city centers that they aren't in yet, at least not on the ground in any significant number. So we're seeing that. And of course that has been leading to, and as you would expect it would, when you're relying more on long-range fires, you're gonna cause more damage. And you're going to kill more people and injure more people, and so that's what we think is happening. That's what we're seeing them do, and we think it's because again they have not been able to make up for the lost time that they continue to suffer from on the ground in terms of the advancement of ground forces.
And they have not taken control of any of the cities yet? Is that?
I wouldn't say no cities. I mean, we do assess that Kherson fell to the Russians around the coast of the Sea of Azov, a town called Berdansk. We believe they have control over, certainly we believe that they're in control of that power plant up near the Dnipro River that we talked about last week. So some smaller towns as they continue their advance down south. In the north, we do not see them have any control over Kyiv. Kharkiv, still a lot of heavy fighting outside Kharkiv, and of course Kharkiv is really becoming a victim to a lot of these long-range fires. And then in that town to the northeast of Kyiv called Cherniv, they still are attempting to encircle the city, but they have not taken it yet. So again, I think down south you see them have a little bit more success and some control over some local population centers, but but up in the north, not so much. The other one that I would note is Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, just to the south of the Donbass. We believe that they very much are aimed on taking Mariupol. Mariupol is a violent place to be right now. This is another location for long-range fires and bombardment. You've heard the mayor himself talk about power outages and water supply problems. We believe that they are trying to encircle Mariupol as well, but they have not done it yet.
The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby with reporters in the Pentagon briefing room. Secretary of State Antony Blinken continuing his visit to Eastern Europe, to the Baltic countries today of Lithuania and Latvia. He'll be in Estonia, the third country, on Tuesday. All three nations are NATO members and former Soviet republics. At a joint news conference with the Latvian Prime Minister in Riga, Secretary Blinken seeking to, as Associated Press puts it, calm any fears they have about their security in the event Russia chooses to expand its military operations.
We're also bolstering our shared defense. We and our NATO allies are prepared to meet any threat. President Biden spoke to the American people just a few days ago in his State of the Union address, and he made clear, again, something he's affirmed repeatedly: we will defend every inch of NATO territory against aggression coming from anywhere at any time. Our commitment to Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is ironclad. The President has called it sacrosanct, and no one should have any doubt about that.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Riga, Latvia. On Tuesday, after that stop in Estonia, he'll be heading on to Paris to meet with the French President Emmanuel Macron. Standing beside Blinken today, the Latvian Prime Minister, Edgars Rinkēvičs, who says his country would welcome having U.S. forces deployed there permanently as a safeguard against Russia. You'll be hearing the voice of the interpreter.
We also talked about further reinforcement of the eastern flank of NATO and reinforcement or strengthening of the regional security of Baltic countries. I would like to thank the United States, Canada, Spain, other allies who are already contributing to our security and have also contributed additionally to our security more recently. Of course, looking at the most recent developments, we are very happy about the permanent presence of U.S. forces here in Latvia. We have no illusions about Putin's Russia anymore. I don't really see any good reason to assume that Russia might change its policy.
Through an interpreter, the Prime Minister of Latvia with Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Riga. From the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. is deploying another 500 troops to Europe in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a senior defense official saying, pushing the total number of American forces in the region to 100,000. As part of the deployment, the U.S. sending KC-130 refueling tanker aircraft to Greece. The U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi sending a letter over the weekend to House Democrats saying the House is exploring a bill that would ban the importation of oil and other Russian energy products into the United States. Today, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, calling for such a boycott of oil and Russian exports, all other exports, not only by the U.S., but by all countries.
If the situation gets worse, then new sanctions need to be introduced to bring peace. Boycotting Russian export and embargo on oil from Russia. When you refuse to give money to the terrorists, if they don't want to stick to civilized rules, and they can get their benefit from the war if they want to. If somebody loses their mind, then we need to lose the fear and forget about commerce and business. We need to fight against inhumane evil that wants to destroy the humanity itself. Spirit of Ukrainian nation and strict sanctions from the world. These are the steps we need to take. They targeted Mykolaiv, they targeted Kharkiv, burned residential areas. They stroke other places in Ukraine. It's just terror actions. They keep Bucha, Hostomel, and other little towns and villages seized temporarily until they get punished. And they will get punished because our armed forces know how to fight back. This enemy is demoralized by what they've found in Ukraine.
Through an interpreter, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posting a video today. President Joe Biden, up to this past weekend, had been opposed to banning Russian oil from the U.S. market, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying on Sunday the Biden administration is speaking with other partners and allies, quote, to look in a coordinated way at the prospect of banning the import of Russian oil while making sure there is still an appropriate supply of oil on world markets. The White House also saying they want to coordinate with European partners because there's more Russian oil heading to their markets than to the U.S. market. And gas prices in the U.S. already at an all-time high, topping $4 a gallon for the first time since 2008. According to AAA, national average is $4.06. That's up 45 cents in 1 week. The highest, California, $5.34 on average a gallon. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked today when a decision might be made on whether to ban Russian oil to the U.S.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has suggested that Russian oil imports should be banned. We're already seeing that Russia is struggling to sell some of its oil, which suggests that supplies are destabilized. Given that fact, would President Biden sign a ban, and what would hold him back from doing so if not?
Well, no decision has been made at this point by the president about a ban on importing oil from Russia, and those discussions are ongoing internally and also with our counterparts and partners in Europe and around the world. I would note that what the president is most focused on is ensuring we are continuing to take steps to deliver punishing economic consequences on Putin, while taking all action necessary to limit the impact to prices at the gas pump. And as you noted, yes, it is true that there has obviously been an impact of the invasion on the level of import to the United States and to other parts of the world. I would note, as we're having these conversations, and obviously the president talked with a number of his European partners this morning about a range of issues. This was part of it. But if you look at Russian imports, they account for about a third currently of Europe's oil imports. So the data we have that we have available at this point in time is back to 2021, not that long ago. But just to give you a point of comparison, the amount that the United States was importing back in 2021 before the invasion was about 700,000 barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum. The Europeans import about 4.5 million barrels per day of oil. So obviously we're also very well aware, as we're having these conversations and as we're consulting with our partners, that there would be, we have different capacities and capabilities.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. We'll hear from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in just a moment, but first a view from Congress. This is James Comer, Republican from Kentucky.
I rise to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine in the face of unprovoked Russian invasion. Vladimir Putin's war has sent millions of Ukrainians fleeing, and he is now targeting civilian populations, schools, and hospitals. Economic sanctions have begun to cripple their economy. Private sector companies have also isolated Russia from many aspects of the 21st century economy. But unfortunately, all economic leverage has not been utilized. We must do more. I do not support sending American troops into this conflict. However, America can demonstrate leadership by cutting off our purchases of Russian oil. But just like on many other aspects of this crisis, President Biden is playing catch-up. He is yet to take the common sense step of stopping American financing of Russia's oil economy. Now more than ever, we should be massively increasing domestic oil production. But President Biden is more focused on pandering to his far-left environmental base than making America energy independent from an enemy. We must stop financing Russia's war on Ukraine. President Biden must act.
That's Congressman James Comer, Republican from Kentucky, on the House floor today. Associated Press has this. Senior U.S. officials secretly traveled to Venezuela over the weekend in a bid to unfreeze hostile relations with Vladimir Putin's top ally in Latin America, a top oil exporter whose re-entry into U.S. markets could mitigate the fallout at the pump from a possible oil embargo on Russia. The outcome of the talks with President Nicolas Maduro's government wasn't immediately clear. That from AP. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson asked today about the possibility of banning Russian oil in his country and other countries, and he says at this point he doesn't support that.
There are different dependencies in different countries, and we have to be mindful of that. And you can't simply close down use of oil and gas overnight, even from Russia. That's obviously not something that every country around the world can do. We can go fast in the UK. Other countries can go fast, but there are different dependencies. What we need to do is to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction and we all share the same assumptions, and that we accelerate that move. And I think that is what you're going to see. And you've heard that from leaders around the world. And actually, I see no inconsistency, by the way, in moving away from dependency on Russian hydrocarbons to moving away from dependency on hydrocarbons altogether. And you can see how this will encourage the world to go, Gary, for green solutions wherever possible. But clearly, there is going to be a transitional period. We're going to have to look for supply. We're going to have to look for substitute supplies from elsewhere, and we're going to have to do it together across the entire coalition of countries that is now condemning Putin's actions.
As the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a joint news conference at 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence in London, by the visiting Prime Ministers of the Netherlands and Canada. CNBC writes stocks fell again on Monday following 4 straight weeks of declines as investors grew increasingly concerned higher energy prices stemming from the Russia-Ukraine conflict would slow the economy and raise inflation. The Dow down 797, NASDAQ down 482, S&P down 127. Former Undersecretary of Defense in the U.S., Michelle Flournoy, she served under President Obama, was recently part of a delegation of senior defense and security officials that President Biden asked to go to Taiwan as a show of solidarity for that island nation, a nation that China claims is part of one unified China. Michelle Flournoy talking today about the delegation's aim and message in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and potentially China's invasion of Taiwan.
In the midst of the Ukraine crisis, China has been rattling the saber even more vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I think this administration was right to want to reach out and reassure the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese authorities that even though we're obviously preoccupied with Europe, we are thinking about you. We are committed to supporting your ability to develop your own defense capacity. We're committed to you as a democracy and as a very important economic and technological partner in the Indo-Pacific. And so we went out to meet with the members of the administration and convey that message. And it was very, very timely. There's a lot of discussion about the parallels or lack of parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan, and so much so that, as Taiwan is one of the main manufacturers of masks. While we were there, they handed out the Stand with Ukraine masks that we could all wear. But I think, one of the most important things that needs to happen in this crisis is that China needs to learn the right lessons, which is not that you can just walk in and invade a thriving democracy and get away with it, but that you will experience tremendous costs. My hope is that what happens to Russia in the mid to long term as a result of this action will be a very sobering lesson for Xi Jinping when he thinks about the future of Taiwan after the 20th Party Congress this year.
Yeah, I can't help but think that Xi Jinping must be very unhappy with Putin at this stage, not only just for generally complicating his life in terms of China walking the line here in their response, but also I do think that if China did move in to Taiwan at this point, go against Taiwan, that it would be compared very much so to Ukraine in a way that if this hadn't happened, Xi Jinping may have been able to muddy that narrative a bit more.
Right, yeah. And I do think, this is more the China-Russia relationship. I think we have to be careful that it doesn't become a more strategic alliance, but at this point I really do think of it more as a marriage of convenience. But I think if Putin continues to misjudge or goes too far, I think there will be a point where Xi wants to distance himself. We're not seeing that yet. I think right now he's doubling down on trying to soften some of the economic impacts that Putin will experience from the sanctions. But longer term, I think, I hope that what will eventually happen to the Russian economy and to Putin's, power, if you will, or I think he's going to make himself an international pariah for the remainder of his days. And I don't think that's something that she is interested in becoming.
Michelle Flournoy was Undersecretary of Defense under President Obama in a conversation with Suzanne Spalding, who was Undersecretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, and Susan Spalding now with CSIS, which hosted this program, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. China's foreign minister today calling Russia his country's most important strategic partner and one of the most critical bilateral relationships in the world. Foreign Minister also claiming that the real goal of the United States' plans in the Indo-Pacific was to develop Asia's response to NATO, and that doing so would, quote, run counter to the common aspiration of the region for peace, development, cooperation, and win-win outcomes, and it would be doomed to fail. Washington Today continues in a minute.
This week on the Lectures in History podcast, a lecture about mid-20th century educational films used to teach students about nuclear warfare and science. Virginia Commonwealth University professor Karen Rader explains.
They've had a lot of success with the use of film for conveying information, for persuading, for convincing. Of course, they would think that it would have more applications in the classroom, but this became even more urgent in the context of the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and the real escalation of what several people have called the nuclear culture or the nuclear future.
The Lectures in History podcast. Find it and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a virtual press conference with U.S. lawmakers over the weekend. A few of them came to the Senate floor today to talk about that and the Biden administration's request for emergency military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. First, Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, Republican from Kentucky.
The eyes of the American people and the entire world are fixed on Eastern Europe. Vladimir Putin is continuing his unjustifiable invasion of a sovereign country and his unprovoked killing of innocent people. Over the weekend, senators were honored to speak electronically with Ukraine's brave leader, President Zelensky. His courageous leadership has helped rally freedom-loving people the world over to the Ukrainian cause. One of his main pleas was that America and our partners continue providing Ukraine with additional military assistance, and to do so very quickly. Long before the invasion began, I was on this floor warning the Biden administration that we could not let assistance be trickled out at the speed of bureaucracy. I certainly hope that lesson has finally been learned.
Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader on the Senate floor. Also on the call and on the floor today to talk about it, Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, the majority whip.
Last week, I led more than 40 senators, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, asking President Biden to extend temporary protected status to the 75,000 Ukrainians who are currently in the United States on student and work visas. On Thursday, and I knew he would, the President responded favorably. He's granting that protection. Congress should also act without delay to approve $10 billion this week in emergency aid to assist Ukraine and bolster our NATO allies, as well as support neighboring nations like Poland and Moldova that are providing safe havens to the refugees. And after listening to President Zelensky on Sunday, I thought to myself, how can we possibly be importing Russian oil and gas, giving the profits of those transactions to Vladimir Putin to pay for his war machine? I believe now, and I've co-sponsored the legislation that reaches this goal, that the United States should ban the purchase of Russian oil to further tighten economic pressure on Putin. I joined the legislation introduced by Senators Murkowski and Manchin to do that.
Senator Dick Durbin, the majority whip on the Senate floor. The Biden administration's request for that emergency aid for Ukraine, $10 billion, expected to get packaged along with an emergency request for dealing with COVID-19 in the U.S., another $20 billion, and all rolled into a larger U.S. government funding bill. We spoke about that and what else is on tap for Congress this week with Casey Wooten, reporter for National Journal.
Ukraine and the omnibus funding legislation and COVID aid are really going to drive this week. As far as Ukraine goes, a lot of that money is going to go toward the $10 billion is going to go toward paying for some of the troop movements for U.S. forces to Eastern European NATO allies. Additionally, another $5 billion is going to go to the State Department and USAID for humanitarian aid for the hundreds of thousands of refugees that are pouring over the Ukraine-Poland border and in areas like that. So that is the bulk of the aid. This Ukraine aid is likely to ride on the upcoming omnibus funding legislation, and really that is driving that funding bill. It's really going to grease the wheels in Congress to get that bill through. Ukraine aid has a lot of support, and we can definitely see a push to include that this week and to get it done early this week.
When it comes then to members of Congress and them being briefed either by the administration on the latest in Ukraine or hearing in testimony from that, will any of that occur this week?
We are going to see some additional classified briefings on Ukraine. The White House is supposed to come down to Congress, or come up to Congress rather, and fill in members with additional information on what's going on the ground there. That said, members are going to be leaving, at least House Democrats are going to be leaving on Wednesday for their annual policy retreat. They're going to get additional information from out of government sources at the policy retreat on Ukraine. But earlier this week, we're going to see some classified briefings, yes.
As far as that retreat then, President Biden is expected to speak on Friday. Do we know the theme or at least some of the other discussions that will take place?
The sessions at the policy retreat, which is going to be held in Philadelphia, are going to range from things like inflation to voting rights. Essentially, Democrats want to craft a platform that's going to help them stem some of these losses that they're expecting in November. So we're going to see issues related to a lot more. They're going to push a lot more bills that are less ambitious than, say, the Build Back Better Act. And so that's really what they're looking for. The Senate is likely going to pass a postal service reform bill this week. The House passed last week legislation granting benefits to veterans who were affected by toxic burn pits. We're really going to see something in that vein in terms of the Democratic platform that's going to emerge from this policy retreat. We can see things like lowering the cost of insulin, and also some of the topics President Biden brought up in his State of the Union address, most particularly doing something to address the spike in crime. So those are some of the themes that we're going to see emerging from the policy retreat at the end of this week.
You had mentioned at the top, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but COVID funding might be part of negotiations or efforts this week as well.
So appropriators and leadership have a lot of work to do still on this omnibus. The House so far is continuing to plan to vote on something Tuesday before they leave for the policy retreat, maybe early Wednesday. COVID, which is the White House has proposed about $22.5 billion in additional aid that would go toward things like medical equipment, vaccines, especially vaccines for the under 5 population that the government expects to approve vaccines for at some time in the future. But there's an issue. Senate Republicans, they want more oversight of the money that's already been appropriated for COVID aid. And so there's still a disagreement there that they're going to have to work out before they can advance any type of additional COVID aid funding in Congress. What's likely going to happen is that $22.5 billion is going to get cut, and they're going to see perhaps some more provisions creating more oversight for the money that's already been allocated.
National Journal reporter Casey Wooten joining C-SPAN on Monday morning's Washington Journal. As always, you can follow the House and Senate live, gavel to gavel, on the C-SPAN networks or on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app. The global death toll from the coronavirus pandemic, now over 6 million, according to data from Johns Hopkins University. U.S. has the most COVID-19 deaths of any country, over 958,000. Brazil is second, over 652,000. India comes in third, over 515,000. Still, COVID-19 restrictions, such as mask mandates, are being repealed in many U.S. states. New York City Mayor Eric Adams ending the public school mask mandate in the largest school district in the country in his city, but only for children kindergarten through 12th grade, not yet for those under 5 years old. He told Spectrum News in New York why.
We have been clear that we have a very conservative approach. Our goal was really to get our numbers down to a certain level, and then we will continue to move forward. And we're there. The science and the doctors, my health team, were very clear. We're not going to rush this, and that is why we're doing K through 12 children first, identify if there's a spike, and then we will start looking at our babies that are less than 5. So we're all going to get there together, but we're going to do it safely so we don't have to close down our city again.
Okay, so you brought up the under the age of 5 thing, which was what I was about to talk about, because those parents are coming after you. They've got a rally planned on the steps of City Hall today, some of them saying, why can't our 3-year-olds, our 4-year-olds take off their masks? Here's one comment that we saw. I think this was a Twitter comment earlier from Holly, who got out there and said that she says these kids can go into a restaurant and eat without a mask. They don't need proof of vaccination there. What do you say to those parents who say, why do you keep this in place for the 4-year-olds?
I need them to trust me. They trusted me when I stated our schools should remain open because it was the safest place. They trusted me when I looked at the mandates and executed the plan. I really need their trust on this. I am not going to allow those babies to keep a mask on throughout the time they're in school. They're in close environment and confined to that. They are not vaccinated, and the numbers show that they're the highest numbers that are hospitalized when you look at children. So we're going to get there. If you do it all at once, you're being reckless. We're first going to do K through 12. Then we're going to come back and make sure those babies can take off their mask also. I just need a little trust here. And I know there's a lot of anxiety. And Pat, this is New York. Yeah. Every decision you make, you're going to have at least 10 people who are going to be against it. But we're going to get there together.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams, a Democrat on Spectrum News, as that lifting of the mask mandate for school children K through 12 takes effect today. This from the Miami Herald Tribune. Defying guidance from the nation's top infectious disease and pediatric health experts, Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo announcing Monday that the state will become the first to recommend that healthy kids not get vaccinated for COVID-19. The article goes on that Florida is going to be the first state to officially recommend against the COVID-19 vaccines for healthy children, Ladapo said, without elaborating on the details or rationale for the forthcoming guidance from the State Department of Health. This from the Washington Post. Hundreds of trucks, cars, and SUVs protesting the government's response to the pandemic circled the Capitol Beltway on Monday for a second day of protests, hoping to boost the group's visibility while seeking meetings with lawmakers in Washington. Organizer Brian Brazzi said the group, which began its protest Sunday with 2 loops around the Beltway, said it has no plans to take the protest beyond the highway, but acknowledges a passionate faction in the convoy that wants to head into the nation's capital. Brian Brazzi speaking with members of the convoy in Hagerstown, Maryland, Monday morning about why he doesn't think they're going to enter.
Brian Brazzi and the organizers are fearful of them trying to do to us what they did to those involved in January 6th. It is our belief that they will try to do that. So with that said, we are making diplomatic moves. That means that we're not that means at this time, meaning today and tomorrow, we are not and will not go into D.C. proper. Again, I know some here really passionately want that to happen. But I have to worry about the safety of the children that are in this convoy. Yes. I have to worry about the safety of each and every single one of you, and I don't want that on my conscience, that I brought people down there and bad stuff happened. Right there's a little baby up in the air. We need to protect that.
From Monday morning at the Hagerstown Speedway, Hagerstown, Maryland, before the convoy headed towards the Beltway. More from the Washington Post story. The group says it wants to hold lawmakers accountable for the government's pandemic responses, describing frustrations with workplace vaccine mandates and other measures intended to limit the spread of the coronavirus. And the group saying that so far Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, has agreed to meet with the group. And they are working to get a meeting with Senator Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas. The Biden administration proposing today to reduce pollution generated by heavy-duty trucks up to 90% by 2031. If the rule goes into effect, it would be the first update to current regulations in 20 years. The EPA Administrator Michael Regan with the announcement this morning.
72 million people are estimated to live near truck freight routes in America. And they're more likely people of color and those with lower income. Those overburdened communities are directly exposed to pollution that leads to respiratory and cardiovascular problems, among other serious and costly health effects. As directed by President Biden's executive order, EPA is proposing new, ambitious standards to significantly reduce emissions from smog and soot-forming nitrogen oxides from heavy-duty gasoline and diesel engines used on the nation's roads and highways. This will ensure that the portions of the heavy-duty fleet that continue to rely on the internal combustion engine during the transition to cleaner alternatives will deliver much-needed protections to our most vulnerable communities. These emission standards would do that by cutting nitrogen oxide emissions from trucks by as much as 60% in 2045, and by strengthening greenhouse gas standards for the model year 2027, resulting in widespread air quality improvements across the country, especially in areas already overburdened by air pollution from diesel engines. This proposed rule would ensure that the heavy-duty vehicles and engines that drive American commerce and connect people all across the country are as clean as possible while charting to advance zero-emission vehicles in the heavy-duty fleet. The benefits of this action would exceed its cost by billions of dollars, with the B, billions, saving lives, reducing emergency room visits, and preventing days of school and work lost to illness. And we've designed these ambitious standards so that they are feasible for the trucking industry after giving appropriate consideration to cost and other factors. But this is only the first step in EPA's three-part plan to get us to that zero-emission freight sector more rapidly. The next piece of the Clean Trucks Plan will reduce air and climate pollution from medium-duty vehicles, and the third will establish new and significantly stronger greenhouse gas standards for heavy-duty vehicles beginning as soon as model year 2030. We're taking this three-step approach because the freight and trucking sector is broad and complex, and because we cannot afford the health environmental injustice, and climate consequences of waiting for every single segment to transition to zero-emission technology on its own.
The EPA Administrator Michael Regan today in the Eisenhower Executive Office building right next to the White House, joined by the Vice President Kamala Harris, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and the head of the Federal Transit Administration, Nuria Fernandez. A White House fact sheet saying that these new truck pollution standards would prevent about 2,000 premature deaths, 6,700 hospital and emergency room visits, and 18,000 cases of childhood asthma. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more top Washington stories sent right to you by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. Go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. Hope you have a good night.